And the UNGA kicks off with a summit on the Millennium Development Goals. The aim is to cut world poverty in half in just 5 years from now, 2015. The three-day summit on the MDGs begins with the sobering fact, though, that the organization is $20 billion short on the 2010 commitments. Well, for more, I'm joined by investigative journalist Webster Tarpley. Webster, always good to see you. So you heard the intro, a little bit short on money. Who's to blame here?
Well, the world banking community, of course, because they don't pay their taxes. What we're talking about is the Millennium Goals, 8 areas, right? World poverty, education, child mortality, maternal health, other things. And the hope is that you can reduce the extreme poverty, people living on less than $1.25 a day, from about 1.5 billion to only 920 million in 5 years. But everybody, I think, now agrees that's being honest, that this goal is getting farther away, not getting closer. Now, the one speech today that I think stood out with something concrete that people can act on is, of all people, French President Nicolas Sarkozy. And his question was, 10-minute speech, there's budget pressure all over the world. If you don't have this money to do the development goals, where could you get it? And the obvious place to get it is tax the banks. Tax the people who caused the depression, tax the people who are generally, a little bit like the French nobility before 1789, say that they're immune to taxation. So
but
tax the banks.
Isn't that political suicide, though,
Evidently
for some
not.
leaders? For some leaders?
No, for some. But for Sarkozy, it's a political lifesaver because he's got to contend with Dominique Strauss-Kahn, the head of the International Monetary Fund. In other words, the biggest lobbyist for the bankers, the profiteers, and the speculators. So he's got ulterior motives. But let's look at what he says. It's a financial transaction tax. Now, people may know this as a Tobin tax, as a securities transfer tax, as a Wall Street sales tax. I think that says it all. In Britain, it's known as a Robin Hood tax, and it became a bit of an issue in the British election. So, small percentage of world financial turnover turns into huge amounts for world economic development. Now, obviously, the questions are, who gets this money? How is it used? How is it collected? Right? Does it go to the IMF and the World Bank? Well, no. We certainly don't want that. Sarkozy will be the head of the G20 and the head of the G8, the president, starting in November. And he's going to use this for his election campaign. And I think this is actually, it's a boon for the world. Just to give an example of how much money could come out of this. The Bank for International Settlements does a survey every 3 years about world financial flows. And what they've found is that as of right now, and you can read this in the Wall Street Journal September 1st, we have 4 trillion a day in foreign exchange transactions, world currency markets. Now that means 1,000 trillion a year, 1 quadrillion of currency. A very tiny percentage has anything to do with trade. This is mostly pure speculation. So if you get 1% of that, that's 10 trillion. $10 trillion. All
right, but the obvious question then is, why hasn't this been done already?
Yeah, right.
Which takes me back to my question of whether or not it's political
suicide. Well, let's see who says no, right? Obama says no, obviously. Geithner, Summers, they say no. Canada says no. The British, with the new government, say no, even though Gordon Brown said yes. The Chinese have gotten themselves into this club of Britain, the U.S., and Canada. And unless the Chinese are going to join the English-speaking union, they better revise their position on this. But in favor of it, France, Germany, Brazil, Norway, Austria, quite a number of countries. So there's significant support. Let me add, here in the United States, the AFL-CIO is for it. We got a faction in the Democratic Party around Congressman DeFazio. We got Robert Kuttner at the American Prospect. We have Green Party candidates running in these elections, from Laura Wells in California to Howie Hawkins in New York, who say, tax the banks. Ralph Nader, well-known figure here, has just called attention to the fact that New York State already has a Tobin tax, a Wall Street sales tax, but they're not collecting it. And it's about $20 billion a year. And New York State has been saying, oh, no, you guys, you Wall Street guys are so wonderful, you should keep this money. So it's politically explosive. It's not political suicide in this kind of a climate. Most people think that Wall Street is already taxed. And when they realize that it's not, they go berserk.
You mentioned third-party candidates, and we all know how "quote-unquote" well that they do here in the political system. But let me bring up another point. UN General Secretary Ban Ki-moon, he said that Africa accounts for 80% of that gap, which means about $16 billion. Right. Are the countries that make up that continent, are they part of this discussion if so much of this has to do with them?
Well, the French are the ones who take this most seriously because of the French interest in Africa, most considerable, right? They do more for Africa. They talk about it more than anybody else in the Permanent Five. And Sarkozy referred to Africa a couple of times in his speech. He said, 1 million people die of malaria in Africa every year. So he said, I'm going to be here for 10 minutes. 30 children in Africa will die of malaria just in the time that I'm talking to you. Now, what's a banker going to say? That, no, I've got to have my second yacht and my second private jet so that these children can die. Let me just get back to what could be done. There's a lot of talk about Pakistan, right, the floods. Now, that's the Indus River. With the kind of money you'd get from a Wall Street sales tax or a financial transaction tax, you could essentially do the full Tennessee Valley Authority treatment for the Indus, and you wouldn't have those floods. The Ganges Brahmaputra, same thing. The Nile, the Congo, the Rio de la Plata, the Amazon, the Mekong, right, the Mackenzie River in Canada, you name it. You could do essentially a simultaneous treatment of the TVA model of all of those places. You would actually wipe out unemployment in the advanced countries using that money. So this would go, this is far beyond what Sarkozy has in mind, but once the idea of taxing the banks, once that genie is out of the bottle and stays out of the bottle, I think that has tremendous potential for getting the world out of the depression where we are now. So, of all people, Sarkozy, but gold is where you find it. And I would urge people, grab a hold of this with both hands and with your teeth, if you can, because this is the most promising thing that I've heard from the UN in many, many years.
Investigative journalist Webster Tarpley, always chock full of notes, chock full of information. We appreciate you being here today.
Thank you.